So perhaps you could tell us a bit about how you first became interested in ethnomusicology, Dr. Picken.
Well, it happened very, very much by degrees. When I was in my teens, of course, there was no such thing as musicology even, let alone ethnomusicology. I remember a physiologist friend of mine saying that his professor of physiology, A.B. Hill at King's College London, no university, had said that a relative of his was actually studying a subject called musicology in the United States. And we all threw up our hands in horror and laughed heartily. So there was absolutely no possibility of any sort of academic career in the musical field when I was 14, 15, 16. Indeed, when I was coming up to being a scholarship candidate here. And in my family, on my mother's side, of Welsh extraction, which is perhaps significant, I had a redoubtable aunt who could play every stringed instrument that was, after a fashion. She also played and taught piano, and I was her pupil. And she lived a hand-to-mouth existence, playing in cinemas, picture houses, as we usually called them then. Occasionally I was called in to deputise for her. So I had quite a practical experience of music at a fairly early age. And nobody thought it was a suitable life for a male. And so there was never any question of music being my career. I was quite a reasonable pianist. I could sight read like mad. I often played things best the first time I ever played them. But I gather Thurston Dodd did that as well, so I'm in fairly good company. Anyway, what happened was that I started life as a zoologist. I'd been vaguely drawn to both China and Japan as a child. I remember actually dressing up in various garments of my mother's and pretending I was Japanese, and in the garden with a footstool as a table and this sort of thing. Nothing really happened until when I was doing my first research at the Plymouth Marine Biological Laboratory. There was a young Chinese physiologist, a pupil of this self-same Professor Hill I mentioned before, and I'd taken with me to Plymouth a bilingual text of what we used to call in those days the Book of Odes, the Shijing, the collection of song texts allegedly assembled by Confucius and used, according to tradition, in the instruction of the young nobility. And this wasn't purely a sort of moralizing exercise on the part of Confucius, if indeed he did it, but it was a necessary part of the education of a young nobleman to be able to sing some of these songs, at any rate, at more or less official banquets. And so this was possibly why the collection was put together. And for the very first time, I heard what Chinese really sounds like, because he read some of these to me. And he was so impressed by my interest, which had already come into being in Chinese music, because of course these song texts of the perhaps 7th century BC, some of them perhaps earlier, are full of references to instruments and particular songs and so forth, that he wrote to China and obtained for me a book on Chinese music. And that was the beginning. There were a number of tunes in it, and by then I'd learned a little Chinese and I could pick my way through it here and there and transcribe the tunes. That was really the beginning, and then nothing happened for years because I became absorbed by my zoological studies. And it wasn't until the war came and I was left intellectually relatively at a loose end that anything else happened. I was, as all young scientists were, I was put into the Central Scientific Register, and a job was found for me as lay officer in charge of the Eastern Regional Blood Transfusion Lab, which was out in Stories Way, in what had been the entomological field station, and I think is again the entomological field station. And my days were spent in a sterile room filtering human serum and bottling it. And so as this stuff came through its filter, I had plenty of opportunity for meditation on this and that. And at the same time, there was a young Chinese writer who had a special fellowship at King's, Xiao Qian, and somehow I was introduced to him. I forget how the contact was established, and it was he who put me in touch with the then professor of Chinese, Gustav Hallam, and I used to go to Hallam along with a young Polish woman, a refugee presumably, for a 2-hour session once a week on what he called elementary grammar. And by the time I got to the end of his elementary grammar course, I had a smattering of Chinese epigraphy, historical phonetics, periodization of Chinese literature. We were expected to use dictionaries in all the Chinese dictionaries in all the European languages. Hallam himself had once been required to have a speaking knowledge of all the 20-odd languages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the Great War. And so by the time I got to China, the reason why I went, I'll come to in a moment, I had a fair smattering of this and that. Again, from the Central Register, I was lifted out of that and asked to go and join Joseph Needham, who by then had set himself up in Chongqing in what was called the Sino-British Science Cooperation Office, Zhongying Kexue Hezuguan. And this was a sort of glorified post office for exchange of information and requests of all kinds between the Chinese and people in the UK. He went out as an expert lecturer in special topics in his own field of biochemistry, first of all. And he had discovered the really profound needs of the science teaching departments of universities, many of them evacuated from eastern China into remote districts of western China with not even the most elementary apparatus to teach with, and the fearful consequences of purely textbook training of students. And so he started trying to get the British Council to send out supplies of various kinds. With the Office of Information in Calcutta, they started an actual service of importing simple scientific equipment for class use. In the UK, he could get on to anybody in the scientific establishment in order to secure small supplies of important materials so that a particular piece of research could be carried on, equipment was obtained, and above all, books and periodicals produced in the UK in absolutely all subjects were made available through the British Council. And I went out as a biological assistant to Joseph Needham, and I was expected to go around not just university departments but also research institutes connected with the various aspects of the applied sciences. And before that, I had a period in the UK going around places like the Dairy Research Institute in Reading and Rothamsted and horticultural establishments, so as to be able to talk moderately knowingly about what we were doing. And this is unknown to me. The first person that I met when I arrived in Chongqing, indeed on the second night of my being there, was the then councillor at the Netherlands embassy, Robert van Hulik, and he had known of my musical interests, and he had invited various Chinese musicians, and I was plunged in immediately. And the next day I was taken by Joseph to a bookshop, and I found a very important introduction to playing the Chinese zither, book published about 1850, and so that was a sign of what was about to happen. And very shortly in Chongqing, I was introduced to another old man who made this instrument, the Chinese 17 zither, and I acquired one of his instruments. The making of this instrument is one of the respectable manual tasks that a Chinese gentleman could undertake. He could also practice his calligraphy, of course, every day. He could carve seals, he could paint pictures, and he could grow orchids. And this old man did all these things. And this is in fact a zither of this type, but not the one that he made. This is a much older instrument, an 18th century instrument, and this particular one made in China. And it is probably an instrument derived from the archetypal tube zithers of East Asia, made from either a whole tube of bamboo or half a tube of bamboo, originally with strings that were simply pieces of the cortex of the bamboo lifted up with a knife blade. But these, of course, are silk strings, made in a very precise way, twisted from a number of primary strands of silk taken from the cocoon after cleaning. And the really extraordinary thing about this instrument, as compared with all other instruments in the world, is this marking with these studs. In this case, these are mother of pearl studs, but on more glorious instruments they may be made of gold or silver. And these are the harmonic nodes. Of course, these strings are all slack now, and they're not at proper pitches, but that gives some idea of the sound. One needs a bit more nail than I have at present in order to produce the proper note, because you should have the string sliding over the tip of the finger and then engaging, so I'm deliberately having to pluck with the tiny bit of nail that I have. But just to show you, you see there is the harmonic corresponding to the half length of the string, and these nodes mark, these roundels of mother of pearl mark the position of all the harmonic nodes up to the 8th, except for the 7th. The fact that I can't produce a good sound note makes a difference to the quality. And we know that these harmonic notes have been marked at least since the end of the 3rd century AD, and they were probably known long before, because if you have a long string under tension, it's a very natural observation to discover that you can produce the harmonics. And the Chinese make marvelous use of these in compositions for this instrument. The first pieces for it were published at the very beginning of the 13th century, and we have a whole book of tablatures from 1425. Tablatures, of course, meaning that you're told where to put your finger, on which string, how to pluck it, and all the rest of it, but not what the actual note is that's going to come out. Should we hear a little bit of a performer now? This is not the old man I told you of who painted orchids, but this is Mr. Jia Fuxi, who was, I think at that time, probably the best performer in China, certainly the best performer in the part of China unoccupied by the Japanese. And he plays with great musicality, obviously thinking about the music that he's playing in a quite unusual way, possibly because people tend to learn by rote. Sometimes the playing of the instrument is very mechanical, but Mr. Jia was always obviously feeling what he was playing about. And this piece that we're going to hear some of began life in the Sung dynasty, say 10th, 11th century, and has certainly grown over the centuries by the interpolation of what one might call glosses, extra little bits of embellishment that various performers have added at the end of their long life to their own performance of the piece, so that it's grown in length. And so the versions that were written down in the 19th century are very substantially longer than the version that occurs in the handbook of 1425. It is a programmatic piece, but all Chinese instrumental music is programmatic. It always has a non-musical reference. And the reference here is to a landscape in southeastern China, the landscape of the rivers Xiao and Xiang, and it's called Mist and Rain on the rivers Xiao and Xiang. And the original version in 1425 has descriptive titles for every one of the 9 or 10 sections of which the piece is made up. It's rather like the situation with the Debussy preludes, only Debussy puts his title at the end of the piece, but the title is put at the beginning here. And it starts with a prelude entirely in harmonics. And we'll listen to the prelude, and then we'll listen to the beginning of the first statement of the main body of thematic material, where he goes over from registration in harmonics to registration on the open strings. And that prelude in harmonics in the 1425 edition has the title Smoke Rain on Dongting Lake. Smoke rain merely means mist, admittedly, but smoke rain is such a beautiful term that I retain it. And as I say, I acquired a 17 zither. Its name is qin, and it's usually referred to as gu qin, the old qin. Qin being a general term for stringed instruments, made by my orchid-growing friend, Mr. Xu Yanbai. And I acquired a pupil of his as a teacher, and to my great shame, I've forgotten what the name of my teacher was. It sounds incredible and unspeakable, but this has happened, I'm afraid, with time. I remember once feeling utterly saddened when he sang to me the beginning of "Oh Rosemary, I Love You," thinking that this was an example of high Western musical culture. I felt the difficulties of communication really were pretty terrifying. The 17th zither, of course, has always been very much an elitist instrument, to use a term that was unknown in those days. That's to say, it was the province of the scholar gentry only, the people who had achieved a position by passing civil service examinations, who had benefited by the very best kind of traditional Chinese education that anybody could have. And although in theory, of course, the civil service was open to anybody in China from the beginning of the Christian era, in fact, it was only those who were able to receive a very good education who would be able to carry out the rather extraordinary literary tasks that were required in the course of these examinations. And the whole world of this music was vastly removed from any other sort of music in China. The fact that all the pieces were written down was almost unique in the field of Chinese music. It wasn't until the 19th century, for example, that any lute scores in China were available to ordinary people. And yet the 17th zither had printed tablatures of pieces from the 15th century onwards. And of course you had to be literate in order to be able to read them. The tablatures were only used during the process of instruction by a teacher, and in theory you couldn't ever play a piece that you hadn't obtained directly from your teacher, who in turn had obtained it from his teacher. I don't think Chinese ever permitted themselves the arrogance of trying to interpret a tablature that they'd never heard played by their teacher. While I was in China, I went to Chengdu, which was the provincial capital of Sichuan. Chongqing, of course, was important as a port on the Yangtze River, but was only the wartime capital. The real provincial capital, the old city, was Chengdu. And knowing that I was going there and that I was likely to meet a very famous performer on qin and a very famous owner of important historical instruments, Mr. Pei Tiexia, Robert von Hülich asked me to take with me a copy that he had written of the tablature of a very famous piece in the Qin repertory, Zhuangzi, Dreaming of Being a Butterfly, to ask Mr. Pei if he would graciously supply rhythmic note annotations to the score that otherwise had no rhythmic elements in it at all, because this was what you had to get from your teacher and what it was difficult to supply by yourself, because the Qin scores on the whole have no indications of duration at all. So I went to Chengdu, and in due course I met Mr. Pei, and I was privileged to play one of his dated 8th century Tang 7-string zithers. Poor man, he was hounded by the communists, and he committed suicide, and his 2 Tang instruments were burned with him. I met, about a year ago, his grandson and his wife and 2 children. Some of the family had managed to get to the United States, but I was the only living link with the grandfather, and the family in the United States had never heard the 7-string zither played. Most extraordinary situation in which to find myself. It made all the sadder for me because Mr. Pei had invited me to go and be his disciple, having heard me play. I played Puanzhou, the mantra of monk Pu, on the 8th century instrument. And although I'd never touched it before, it was easier to play than the instrument to which I was accustomed. And the harmonics rang out like little bells in the most miraculous way, and they were exactly where they should be on the strings. It really was the most extraordinary musical experience. And the surface of it was covered with very fine cracks. Von Hüllich, in his book on the Qin, says that these only developed when an instrument is something like 1,000 years old. But the astonishing thing was that though you could see these everywhere, you simply couldn't feel them at all with the fingers. Now, in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, I've been shown instruments that are claimed to be tongue instruments. I've never seen one with a lacquer patina like this instrument had. And I'm quite sure that Mr. Pei's instrument really was a tongue instrument. It was also inscribed on the inside in a position impossible to get at without demounting the instrument altogether. I left with Mr. Pei the manuscript tablature prepared by Robert von Hüllich, and after several months it came to me by post in Chongqing, with Mr. Pei's regrets that, never having learned this piece from his teacher, he was unable to offer any suggestion as to how it should be revised. So these are my grounds for saying that Chinese never permitted themselves the arrogance of deciding what the rhythm should be in the absence of teaching. My daily music in Chongqing, after I'd acquired my zither, was practice with the zither, and one uses the tablature only for learning the piece. One never plays from tablature. One may turn to the tablature if one becomes uncertain how a particular passage should be performed, but otherwise one doesn't use the tablature at all. And I found it entirely satisfying as music, and it had an enormously beneficial effect on my musical hearing. It was the first time ever that I'd really thought about the harmonic composition of single sounds. And of course my sense, my The pitch sense also was enormously improved by this. So it really has contributed greatly to my musical development. I didn't attempt to play any other instrument while I was in China, but of course I heard other instruments, and particularly the very characteristic Chinese fiddles that come in an enormous variety, but all essentially of this structure. And as you can see, the extraordinary thing is that the bow passes between the two strings, and by rotating either the instrument or the bow itself, they transfer from string to string. The strings are always tuned a fifth apart. You may get fiddles with the four strings instead of two to get a greater sound, and you get fiddles in which the table here is of wood instead of snakeskin. I think this is a python, and you get again very much more sound from the wooden ones. The bowing is underhand, and the whole thing, as you see, is very reminiscent of viol, treble viol posture in playing, always supported on the knee with the performer sitting in this way, and the string tension controlled by the fingers. So, and the resonator is simply a tube, and presumably this is also was originally a tube of a large diameter bamboo. And it is a spike fiddle with the string carrier going through the body and emerging just below, and the strings are slung around this projection below. The bridge, as you can see, is tiny. What is very interesting to me, at any rate, is that these Chinese bridges so often are reminiscent of the tiny bridges for lyres, and particularly of the lyres that turn up in Europe in, say, 9th to 11th century, that sort of period. Really quite remarkably similar, different, of a different overall size, but their construction is extraordinarily like these. And the scroll here, this is a formalized bat, and it is an auspicious symbol because the word for bat is fu, and fu also means riches. So that element of decoration has a good significance as well. And the performers on these instruments achieve absolutely virtuoso skill. When a former pupil of mine, Dr. Rembrandt Volpert, was doing his lecture in the Department of Musicology in Munich, which all candidates had to do, he chose to talk about this fiddle and its repertory. And the audience absolutely declined to believe that the recordings he played were played by Chinese and were played on such instruments as this. They said, we all know these instruments are hopelessly primitive, and it is inconceivable that Chinese should ever play with this, showing this degree of technique. And altogether it was thumbs down for him. The Chinese, if they were indeed Chinese who played, had obviously received European instruction. And one of the things that all performers on this fiddle play, it has a number of names, by the way. The commonest name is erhu, which may be a reflection of the name duta, two strings, which of course you get in Central Asia. The is two Hu is here a word for a barbarian in general, but more particularly of people from the Iranian area. Hu Qin, that is to say the barbarian. Qin is another name for it, and there are quite a number of other names. And as I mentioned, they occur in a wide range of sizes. Nowadays, of course, the Chinese, experimenting furiously all the time, have turned them into cello and even double bass size instruments as well. But there are standard ones that are used in opera, particularly in the so-called Picken opera. They have special forms, all with very beautiful and varied tone color. And there's one piece that that fiddlers constantly play with a title something like Listening to Birds in the Mountains. Lovely pentatonic tune that recurs rondo-like throughout the piece, and intermittently they will do bird imitations with great virtuosity. The only other musical encounter, in a sense, that I had in China was when I visited the private museum of an elderly gentleman in Chengdu. And this whole unit that I show you is a marvelous example of Chinese consideration, anticipation of the coming of a guest. When I got to the museum, this was all prepared, this little brocade-covered box which has faded with time, gold speckled paper on the inside. This was originally imperial yellow silk lining it, and they labelled with my name, asking me to graciously keep it, saying that it's given by Mr. Huang Xiqiang, and saying what it is, that they are these curious little instruments called xun. These are children's toys, not ritual instruments, but these instruments were used in grown-up size, so to speak, in the Confucian ritual orchestra. They are mentioned in the Book of Odes, the Book of Songs, and in the box along with these two were there, as was a little label, gold speckled paper, beautifully written hand, defining the xun in terms of quotations from the Book of Songs and earlier classics, two different quotations from the Book of Songs. All this prepared for the visit of a foreign devil who happened to be known to be interested in music. And these little objects are historically interesting. This one is a very typical iron oxide tongue glaze, such as you will see on the well-known tongue horses, for example. It's a sort of owl-shaped demon, the eye holes being finger holes, and this one is, of course, a sort of proto-celadon glaze. Again, a quasi-human mask, rather devilish, with little horns growing at the top, and two eye holes for finger holes. Now, Roger blows these much better than I do and gets a beautiful note from them. So, Roger, have a go. It's masterly. Can you generate the three notes just steadily, one by one? was lovely. And so these I brought back home in 1945, Christmas 1945. I got back to Cambridge from China, and after the war we were fortunate enough to have in Cambridge, as a result of the great expansion of teaching in Oriental Studies that occurred as a result of the war, when Eden discovered that there were scarcely two people in England who could really translate a Chinese or Japanese letter. And as a result of this, they decided to develop departments of Oriental Studies regardless of any students wishing to take the courses. You can imagine the consequences of this suggestion being made in Oxford and Cambridge. The fact that anything occurred in Cambridge was really due to Gustav Hallan, the professor of Chinese. He was a refugee from Nazi Germany. He was a Sudeten German. He had been head of the Sinologisches Institute in Göttingen, and it was there that Arthur Whaley went to take advantage of Hallan's marvelous library when he was working on his own translation of the Book of Songs. And it was as a result of Whaley's interest that Hallan was invited to Cambridge. And as I say, it was really because of Hallan's efforts that the Cambridge department was built up as it was. But we had a lecturer in Chinese art and archaeology, and that was Professor Zheng Kun from the West China Museum also in Chengdu, and I met him and his wife when I was there. And years later, seeing my Shun from this well-known site in Chengdu, Professor Zheng Kun gave me this beautiful bird-shaped whistle, rather partridge-like little creature, which is also a rattle, and has little feet, you see. It's got a little wooden stand so that it will stand up, and again three finger holes, 3 holes, one a blowhole and 2 finger holes, so that the bird is held in this position. After I got back to Cambridge in the December of 1945, I was pretty busy as a zoologist for some while, and then Professor Edward Dent and Egon Velis asked me to be responsible for chapters on Chinese and Far Eastern music in the first volume of the New Oxford History of Music that was being planned. And this, of course, led to my undertaking a great deal of reading in those fields, and also of listening, because even at that stage there was a small amount of recorded music from many areas in East Asia. When I realized that I would probably never get back to China, I was led to consider the possibility of going to Turkey. I had a friend then, who's dead now, Philip Olliott. At that time he was a fellow of Peterhouse. He had been fellow of Trinity. He had been director of the Freshwater Biological Association's laboratory on Windermere. And in Peterhouse he was Director of Studies in Natural Sciences, but he suddenly decided to throw it all up and went to live in Yugoslavia. This was, in fact, I'm getting my dates mixed up, this was before the war. In Yugoslavia, when it was likely that the Germans or the Italians would overrun the little village on the Adriatic where he lived, he converted all his capital into gold and went to Turkey. And he was appointed as a professor in biological sciences in Robert College in Istanbul. This was originally a missionary foundation, but had turned into a mixed college, that is a mixed government, mixed staff, American and Turkish, with a conspicuously good engineering section. It is now an independent Turkish university. And he invited me to go and visit him during a long vacation. And it occurred to me that in view of what is quite clear from Chinese historical accounts of instruments and musics, that an enormous amount had come to China from Western Asia, that is to say from Central Asia in relation to China, from the West rather than from Western Asia. It might be worthwhile taking a closer look at the musics from which some element might have been derived that eventually reached China. Expressed in that way, it sounds a fairly fatuous point of view. But we know that a very high proportion of the musical instruments used by the Chinese today, in fact, has come to them from Central Asia. In fact, indeed, almost the only instruments today that were originally Chinese are the 7-string zither, another zither that I've said nothing about, a 13-string zither with movable bridges, the little vessel flutes, the xun, of which you saw toy examples, and the free reed mouth organ. So 4 instruments that are antique in China. But the instruments that one usually thinks of as Chinese instruments, the lutes, the fiddle, the flutes, the reed pipes, are all of Central Asian origin. The fiddle indeed probably came to the Chinese from a Turkic people, the Xianbi, and it is almost certain that this type of fiddle originated in Central Asia, and indeed that all bowed instruments originated there, and they are intimately connected with horses and horse culture, and of course the horse hair was used not merely for the bow but for the strings as well at a certain period. And so when I had this invitation to go to Istanbul, I was very interested to hear what Turkish music would be like. The instrumentarium of the Turks in Western Turkey, and of course among Central Asian Turks, is so close to what the Chinese now regard as their characteristic instrumentarium from many points of view, with lutes and bowed instruments, the flutes, the reed pipes. And first I began to listen to what one may call classical Turkish music, the music that is written down. It wasn't written down in staff notation until the 19th century, but there's quite a large body of this music, cyclical forms, suites of various kinds, and I began to have lessons on the kanun, which is a trapezoidal shaped psaltery with courses of 3 strings to a course. One plays on open strings using plectra attached to the 4 fingers of each hand. And I had lessons. I used to take my kanun on a steamer on the Bosphorus and travel from an island in the Sea of Marmara, where I was a guest in the home of the late Sveti Okya, who had at Ataturk's request instituted an opposition, a parliamentary opposition, because Ataturk thought it would be good for the Turks to have some sort of dual parliamentary system. The only result of that was that poor Fethi Bey was almost murdered by the peasants, who really didn't understand this idea of an opposition at all. He was dead by the time I stayed in that house, but his wife, Galibehan, was still alive, and she was the first woman who had ever entertained foreign diplomats at her own table. I used to take my kanun in a pillowcase, board a steamer, and travel to Istanbul from Büyükada, the large island. In the old days it was called Principe. Büyükada to Istanbul, and then get another steamer to go up to Kireçburnu, where my kanun teacher lived in a beautiful old-style Turkish house. I never saw the ladies of the household, but of course they were enormously intrigued at the coming of a foreigner, and I used to be fed the most delectable sweetmeats throughout my kanun lesson. And my teacher started me off simply playing arpeggios on the kanun. It's very important to strike with equal force with the plectra of either hand, so that it is impossible to tell which hand is playing a note. So one has to have absolute equal touch in the two hands. He tuned my instrument, and rather surprisingly, he always tuned to charga, which is the major scale. This is quite a frequent mode in Iran, but in Turkey it simply doesn't exist as a mode for a piece at all. But nevertheless, the Turks use this as their basic series from which to move into other tunings for other more commonly used Turkish modes. I only mention this because there was a moment in his tuning when suddenly one is absolutely ravished by the euphony. I can't use any other term to describe it. A feeling of such perfection in the beauty of the triads, presumably occasioned by the by the perfection of the fifths and the precise value given to the major third. One is simply to hear him playing up and down the major scale and arpeggio, as it were, C major arpeggios, was utter bliss. I never achieved that sort of tuning myself. And one day he put in front of me, I was started off improvising. You see, he would tune to a particular mode, Hijaz, for example, and would say, play. And so I would play. And then he would say, no, you can't stop there. If you stop there, you're in Humayun, instead of being in Hijaz proper, you see. And so I learned really just what it is that makes mode function as mode in this musical world. And this was one of the things that I had very much wanted to discover, what really is the nature of musical thinking in a culture where modality is still of primary importance, and where to be able to improvise in a mode is a sine qua non if you're going to be any use as a musician at all, accompanying a singer. If a singer is going to sing a song, you've got to present the mode in a brief prelude before the singer begins to sing. So this was enormously valuable from my point of view. I learned more about the nature of mode in those few weeks than I'd ever been able to get out of any description of any edition of Groves. And all the modal functions, of course, these extraordinary names like mediant and dominant, subdominant and so on, they all begin to acquire meaning as functional points in a system when you're actually trying to improvise in a given mode. And after I'd done this for some time, he put in front of me the printed notation of a peshref. A peshref is a sort of overture. It was the first movement in the suite, the instrumental suite, the fasl, which is the instrumental form in classical Turkish music. And of course, being able to sight read, I played on and on and on. And he never really recovered from this shattering experience of seeing how a Westerner would make use of notation. It was something obviously that had never occurred to him before. But after that, of course, I romped away on that particular peshref at any rate. And so that was the introduction really to classical Turkish music, and of course I was listening to lots on the radio and going to concerts and so on. And then Philip Elliott was engaged by the sort of Ministry of Agriculture to travel around Turkey looking for suitable sites for marine biological stations, primarily, of course, to keep an eye on fisheries possibilities. And we went to what used to be called Trebizond, on the eastern Black Sea coast, not so very far away from the border with the Soviet Union. And it was sitting in a garden, having a meal in the dusk on the hillside above Trabzon, that I suddenly heard, coming out of a loudspeaker, the astonishing sound of the Black Sea fiddle. And it was really the Black Sea fiddle that decided me that I got to do something about Turkish music, Turkish folk music. We'll hear it in a moment. It is a musical world totally removed from the world of classical Turkish music. Classical Turkish music is the purest possible linear music that ever was. In ensemble, only the mildest sort of heterophonic texture in different octaves, and the perfection of concentration on perfection of intonation, concentration on the purity of realization of the modal series. This is really a sort of primary aim of the classical music, whereas a great deal of Turkish music is polyphonic in a sense, with the use of complex drones. This is true of the long-necked lutes, an enormous variety of techniques of performance, but all resulting in really quite an elaborately textured music. And the fiddle playing itself, largely in parallel fourths with upper or lower drones, sometimes with all three strings playing in continuous parallels. A most extraordinary and at that time to me entirely new kind of harmonic texture. Whether any medieval musicians ever played the fiddle in this sort of faubourn style, I have no idea at all. But it was immensely exciting to hear this music, and I want you to hear a specimen. But before we do that, I'd like you to hear a specimen of the pure classical style of fiddle playing. This is played on a fiddle with three strings that looks very much like a tiny treble viol. It's unfretted, of course, and the strings, the top string is used as a melody string. The other strings are touched only occasionally. And the peculiar thing about it is that the string is stopped with the fingernail, not with the flesh of the fingertip. And this gives a very characteristic color to the string tone. This fiddle, it's known as the fussel kemençesi. That is, the kemençe simply means a little fiddle. The kemençe that plays in the fussel. The fussel is this type of instrumental suite that may well have grown out of the naubat, the representation bands of dignitaries all the way across from Central Asia to Muslim India, on into Iran, and so into Turkey. But sadly, nowadays, the kemençe is being displaced by the violin. It's just the history of the viols and the violins again. The kemençe is allowed to play in ensemble, but if an improvised prelude on a bowed treble instrument is required, it is the violin that plays it and not the kemençe. Kemençe sits there mute while the violin does what it ought to be doing. Perhaps we could hear some of this fussel kemençesi. That is a small prelude improvised by the Kemenche player to introduce a singer who's going to sing an art song in the same mode. I think the next item on the table is a specimen of the Black Sea Fiddler.
Dicoğlu Osman tarafından Trabzon Sık Sarıoğlu havası.
That, of course, is taken from a gramophone record by the man who announces himself, Picholu Osman. Osman, the bastard son. He was, in his day, one of the finest performers on the instrument on the Black Sea coast. Such people are often picked up by the folk music group in the radio station in Ankara, for example. They, of course, lose their distinctive style to some extent in that environment, and they're often employed to play in a mixed ensemble such as would never occur on the Black Sea coast at all. I met the fiddler who was in the folklore group in Ankara. This would be in 1960 or 61 when I went back to Turkey, and he was quite accustomed to playing in their mixed folk ensembles, playing Turkish folk songs from anywhere, arranging them according to Black Sea style up to a point, but of course he was inaudible in that ensemble, and he was only really required to play solo, which would be the natural thing for him to do. The next step in my approach to this fiddling was when I took a boat by myself along the Black Sea coast. This was a year later, I think, in order to see if I could locate such a fiddler. And I travelled second class on the boat. In the third class, there were a number of sailors going back to their villages along the Black Sea coast, and one was quite a reasonable fiddler, and I used to hang over the rail of the second class deck looking down on the third class, and they soon realized that I was watching and listening, and I was invited down and shown the fiddle. Not in fact this fiddle. This is a larger fiddle than the one that I first met, but it is the same type of construction with this long, narrow body and a very characteristic insertion of the strings. The strings disappear at this point and are taken through the wood down an oblique channel and are then fastened on the pegs inside the hollow head of the fiddle. This phenomenon of disappearing strings is one that one can see in pictures of the viola da braccia in Italian painters of the 15th and 16th centuries, but it had been developed long before that and appears on one instrument in China, which is supposed to be of the 8th century. Whether it originated in Central Asia or actually in China, I don't know, but I would think it more probable that it originated in Central Asia. Anyway, it is an archaic feature on stringed instruments. Whether the particular instrument that shows it in China was a lute or a fiddle is uncertain. When I showed the picture to Thurston Dart, he said they lost the bow in Sogdia. And the fiddle is played again with underhand bowing, the hand in supination with the fingers controlling the bow tension. So I met my fiddler on the ship, and I took down from him some tunes of songs that he sang. But at that stage, I really saw no possibility of transcribing fiddling at the speed that you just listened to the example on the tape. And I didn't begin to understand what could be the cause of the extraordinary breathlessness that one feels listening to this music. It's as if there is a never resolved syncopation. What could be the metrical reason for that? And how is this extraordinary continuity of sound developed? For a fiddle, surely it is most extraordinary to have sound projected as a harmonic continuum in this way. And finally, my little fiddler, his name was Ahmed Güntepe, left the ship at Trabzon to go to his particular village, and I went on for a bit further up the coast. But we agreed that if it was possible, I would meet him the following summer in Turkey. And by that time, I had been able to purchase the very first clockwork-driven tape recorder that was sold by Boozy and Hawkes. It was made by a subsidiary of theirs, weighed about 11 pounds, and you could carry it slung over the shoulder. You had to wind furiously. Sometimes I had to wind while I was recording. And very occasionally my recordings even now show falling pitch due to the motor beginning to run down. And so I went off with this to Turkey. The sailor was at the naval base in Gölcük, where foreigners, of course, were not permitted to go. And so I went to a small town on the Gulf of Izmit. I went, in fact, to Izmit, which is not far from Gölcük, and I took a room. At least I took a bed in a 3 or 4 bedroom, and through correspondence arranged with him that he would come and see me there, bringing his fiddle, and we recorded in the bedroom, and I made notes about the fiddle. And he he came regularly every week for a month, a little more, perhaps a little more than a month. And I was very anxious to get a recording of his playing when men were dancing, so as to get a clearer picture of how, from the dancer's point of view, the music related to its rhythmic structure. And so I suggested that he take the tape recorder with him back into the naval base and record some of his mates dancing to his playing. I also wanted, if possible, to get more than one instrument playing together, because I knew that they do, the performers do sometimes combine their efforts. And so he went off with the tape recorder, and the following week he came back with it. And I put on the tape, and the most dreadful shrieking voices of women came out of the tape recorder. And he had thought that the songs of the chanteuses de café in the naval base were so much more worthwhile as music, as Turkish music, from my point of view, that he had recorded them over the whole of his own playing and the dancing of his mates. And just occasionally, as one song by one of the women finished, there would be a snatch of his music. Of course, I couldn't say anything at all or explain. I could only thank him. But that was really disastrous. But as a result of that, as a result of my telling this story, a most extraordinary legend developed in Cambridge about my having caused a tape recorder with a long lead to be taken into the harem instead of into the naval base. It was almost as difficult to get into the naval base as it would have been to get into the harem. In any case, of course, Turks don't have harems now. But that was the source of that particular legend. Well, then, Ahmed Günther recorded for me in Izmir. But he was not one of the top-class fiddlers. And I'd heard another type of music on the Black Sea coast, and that was the bagpipe. And I thought I would make an expedition with my tape recorder along the Black Sea coast and see if I could find more superior fiddlers and also make contact with the bagpipe players. And I went off to Rize, taking the same coastal steamer along the Black Sea coast, and was introduced by the local education officer to the director of the tea factory in Rize, because he said there were a number of kemençe players. This instrument is also called kemençe. If one wants to differentiate it, then it's called Karadeniz kemençesi. That is the kemençe of the Black Sea, the Karadeniz, the Black Sea. And I went to the tea factory, and this was a wonderful encounter, because the director of the tea factory was a really marvelous man, and he gave all his workmen the afternoon off, and in the tea drying shed we had a great get-together with the best dancers there to dance, and a much older man, Kashif Jivelik, to perform. And this kemençe is the kemençe of Kashif Jivelik. My first kemençeci, my first kemençe performer, was a carpenter, and he therefore had been in a position to make his own instrument. And when I was taking notes about his instrument, he immediately stopped me as soon as I began to measure it, because he knew its dimensions in every direction down to the nearest millimeter. But Kashif had had this instrument made by a local carpenter for him. It is considerably larger than that of Ahmed Güntepe, but in fact the instruments do exist in these two larger and smaller types. And Kashif produced a very superior tone on his instrument, and had a wonderful vocabulary of ornament as well. And I recorded quite a number of pieces from him. And then going up into the mountains to a place that was then called Hemşin. And at that time, in Turkey, one really required permission to go into eastern Turkey, but I found in Ankara that it was impossible to decide in advance for which parts one required a permit, and in any case, impossible to find out from whom one would get such a permit, so I just went. And arrived in Hemşin. The bus driver took me to have a coffee, and while I was sitting there, the Bucak Müdürü, the local lieutenant or magistrate, I suppose one might call him, joined me, and I told him that I wanted to cross the mountains and get down into the neighborhood of Bayburt and so on to Erzurum. And he was tremendously helpful. He immediately drew a sketch map for me of places to go through in crossing the mountains, and furnished me also with a friend, an arkadaş, the man who stands at your back in battle, to escort me. And every day when I walked, I was always with someone who was walking in that direction. But the first thing was that he got together pipers. And the Turkish bagpipe is quite an unfamiliar type. You see, this skin is absolutely rigid, and that is because it has never been tanned. And when the bagpipe is in use in that region, it is kept permanently wet with a strong salt solution. This prevents the bacteria attacking the skin and breaking it down. But it means that it has a horrible slimy feel, of course, all the time. And it will only work, of course, when it is in this saturated condition. And as soon as you allow it to dry out, it becomes permanently distorted, and even though you wet it again, it will never resume its original properties. And there is no drone. But as you see, there is a double charter with a double set of finger holes, one of which is blocked. Sometimes this trough-shaped structure terminates in a little cow horn bell. And in fact, this one, which is completely of boxwood, is carved with serrations at the end, just in the same way as they will carve serrations round the rim of the cow horn bell. There's no valve in the blowpipe, so that you have to put your tongue over the end there as you blow if you want to want to take a breath and stop the air pressure falling inside. The technique. There are really a number of techniques of performance. The advantage of having a double chanter is that you can generate a reinforced melody line with a slight skirl between the notes, adding to the intensity. There is a piece of grass which is stuck up one of these chanters, and that projects here, and it is used for fine tuning. So having your reeds speaking properly. The reeds themselves are hidden in this portion of the bag here. The reeds are not integral to the pipe. They are separate reeds of a narrower bore reed, botanically speaking, downcut reeds inserted into the yoke behind here. The point of having one hole blocked with wax here is that it gives you the facility of gracing with one hole on this pipe while you're playing a tune reinforced by both chanters on the two pipes. Sometimes 2 holes will be blocked, even 3, so that individual pipers can vary the character of the gracing they perform. They differ also very much in their skill. They cross the fingers across the 2 chanters, but they are able differentially to close holes at the same locus on the 2 chanters, so that the piping can be very much more elaborate than my simple account of it suggests. And at times the actual harmonic texture they produce is more complicated, so that you can have drones appearing, upper drones as well as lower drones on this system. Sometimes they dispense with gracing altogether and have 2 identical chanters. The Bucak Müdürü Nuri Trabzonluoğlu is his name, produced various pipers for me. There was a very famous one, middle-aged man called Zulkif, and the Nuri Bey himself was thought particularly highly of a 15-year-old boy whose name was, it's gone from me at the moment, Remzi Beklar. And I don't remember now who is playing in this particular example that we're going to hear. I rather think this is Zulkif. Anyway, this is one of the songs with bagpipe accompaniment sung by the men as they dance. And the text begins, Hodiço dere başı, kırmızı çiçek açar. At the head of the Hodiço river, a crimson flower opens. And it's a love song with overtones that might be associated by such imagery at the outset. The secret, of course, of this, the rhythms here, is that they are fairly high-speed, irregular rhythms in 7s or 11s, 9s, irregularly divided, even more sometimes, 5s of course also. And this incidentally is the secret of the feeling of breathlessness that one gets when listening to the fiddlers. They too are playing in these irregular rhythms. After Bartók, of course, they used to be called Bulgarian rhythms, but they're not confined by any means to Bulgaria. What is peculiar about the rhythms in Turkey and on the Black Sea coast is that they are taken at such a furious pace, especially the fiddlers. In the case of the bagpipers, the overall pace the value, if you like, of the semiquaver is not so small as it is in the case of the fiddlers. Anyway, here is bagpiping with dancers and dancers singing to the bagpipe. The song, of course, consists of a single musical line which is repeated over and over again, and each line of the text is sung first by a leader and then repeated by everybody. And this very small musical unit is characteristic of the entire bagpipe repertory. All the bagpipe tunes consist of tiny little units of perhaps 2 or no more than 4 measures repeated over and over again, and each such melody constitutes the entire repertory of a village, and the tunes are differentiated by the names of the village to which they belong. The village tune may include 1 or more variants, so that there is some change as the piper continues to pipe, but on the whole they are of a quite extraordinary monotony from our point of view. And it isn't just from our point of view. The fiddlers are very much aware of this, and they pour scorn on the pipers. I don't think the pipers mind about the fiddlers, but many times a fiddler has tried to dissuade me from going to record anything from the pipers, and my main fiddlers would both say, I can play anything that the pipers will play for you, and they would thereupon proceed usually to retune their instruments so that they could do a bagpipe imitation for me. And this is an example of a bagpipe imitation by my fiddler from Rize, Kashif Jivelek. I should have mentioned before that the name of the bagpipe, extraordinarily, is simply bag. Nothing else. The Western Turks, that is to say, the Turks in the neighborhood of Istanbul or Ankara, tried to invent a name, Tulum Zurna. Zurna being, of course, the shawm which you find all over Turkey. But the pipers themselves refer to it simply as tulum, the bag. And this is Kashif, who has retuned his fiddle so that he can play an imitation of the bagpipe using, I think, 2 of his strings as a drone. the audience in the tea drying shed were quite amused by this, and Kaushik also, of course, is imitating the calls of the instrument player, while suggesting to the dancers what they should do. But of course, he was really not doing quite what the bagpipers do, because you can't, particularly with this kind of bagpipe, you can't interrupt it readily and give instructions to your dancers. And shouting calls for the changes is what the fiddlers do, not what the bagpipes do. But it's quite a pretty imitation of the sound of the instrument. Another type of Turkish folk music that I have found very wonderful is that of the flute players. The flute players exist all over Turkey, and there are many kinds of flutes. The ones that are musically particularly remarkable are the very long ones, which you see a range of sizes here. The ones that are most favoured by the shepherds are these extremely long ones, and they have a great preference for extremely narrow-bored flutes as well. But of course, to get a flute of this length in one piece and of narrow bore is quite a technical achievement. Because the flutes are so narrow in bore, they overblow very readily, and some of these instruments will overblow to the fifth harmonic range, and they quite commonly make use of the third harmonic range, and sometimes they make use of it in a very remarkable way, so that they take advantage of the shift of a fifth in pitch in the third harmonic range in order to obtain an extraordinary extension of the whole range of the instrument. And this is, on this next tape, we have an example of a man who must have been, in his time, a really virtuoso performer on the instrument. It was recorded in the jail in Sivas when the Turkish recording group from the conservatory in Ankara went there in the early 30s. They found all the best performers on these long flutes. These long flutes are called kaval. This is the general term for such flutes. They found all the best performers were to be located in the local jail. And they have, this tape records a splendid example of a piece with a program which is quite characteristic of the flute player's repertory. It is a musical illustration of the story of a shepherd who wishes to marry his master's daughter. The master says, "You shall marry her if, having kept the sheep without water for a week, you then, by playing your flute, lead them to a stream to drink, and when they're about to do so, you change the tune and they turn back from the brink. You shall have my daughter." And the piece, of course, would normally be interspersed with the comments of the shepherd and the narration of the story. And this particular performance is a really marvelous example of music that is never intended to be written down in notation at all. The complexity of performance is increased by the fact that the performer constantly growls a drone to what he's playing, and sometimes with quite establishing quite remarkable harmonic relationship between what he's playing and what he's growling. The growling voice covers a whole range of quality, from a vague sort of low-pitched growl to a positively clearly pitched singing voice note. And I took this tape with me to Hungary when I was preparing the musical illustrations for the book, the folk musical instruments of Turkey. There was a very obtrusive hum on this recording, and the technicians in the academy in Budapest did their best to clean up the tape, but it still is an imperfect recording, and I hope to goodness somebody made some decent recordings of this since the 1930s. I had great difficulty in transcribing. I had to slow down enormously before I could work out what was happening. It is the time signature changes very frequently, and it begins with quite long phrases in irregular rhythm. When I'd completed my transcription, and even now, but particularly when I was working on it then, even though I was very familiar with what had come out in the slowed down performance of the piece, it moves so rapidly that it is quite difficult to read the score as fast as the flute player plays it. And of course, the reason for this is quite simple. The flute player never been preoccupied by any problem of notation at all. It's his fingers that do it, and his fingers move as fast as his thought can flash through his brain. So it is an extraordinary composition, and I only wish the recording were better. When I had finished the transcription, my old friend in Budapest, Roitsky Benjamin, said to me in English, "Bartók and Kodály always said it should be done to record the growling together with the flute playing. But they didn't do it, and you did it.
Perhaps you could tell us something about the tongue music project then.
I regard this part of my work as the most important work of my life. When I first became interested in Chinese music, and when I was in China, I never thought there was any possibility of recovering any part of the repertory of music played at the town court. The furthest back I could go was to songs of the Sung dynasty, composer and poet, musician Jiang Kui. Of his works, a collection of song texts, some of which had musical notation with them, were printed about 1202. The songs had all been written during the 12th century, and many of them were dated by him, and as is usual with Chinese lyrics, there is often a little prefatory note telling the circumstances under which they were written. And in two cases, he states that he's using a melody which he believed to be of Tang date. But that was the sum total of music that I possibly regarded as Tang. The sum total, at any rate, of secular music that might be regarded as of Tang date. The Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi had preserved 12 tunes for lyrics from the Book of Songs, which he believed to be of Tang date. He believed them to be 8th century, from the Kaiyuan reign period. But those, of course, were a very archaic style of Chinese melody, and it's very doubtful whether they were ever performed at all during the Tang period. I've never been able to find any reference to their performance. And then in 1953, Eta Schneider, a German woman who had been taken on as a teacher in Western music by the court musicians in the palace in Tokyo, began publishing a number of papers on the condition of the Japanese court music. And among other branches of the court music, she talked about the so-called Tang music, Tongyaku, in Chinese Tang Yue. And the scores that she presented, her own transcriptions, bore no resemblance to any Chinese music that ever was. And of course the sound of the Tang music as performed by the court musicians is wholly dissimilar from any known Chinese music, and is so conspicuously dissonant that Chinese, on hearing it, refuse to believe there is any connection at all. But she published in the course of this article a photograph of a manuscript, and it was a type of manuscript in which the tablatures of the two instruments are shown in parallel, and the two instruments were the lute, the biwa, that is Chinese piba, and the mouth organ, Chinese sheng, Japanese sho. And I thought once that both of them were formally typical Chinese writing of melodies. And conspicuously, in the case of the mouth organ, there was nothing there but a melody, whereas in Japanese hands, the mouth organ erects 5 or 6 note chords on every degree of the range of the instrument as far as possible. And so this entire extraordinary shifting harmonic accompaniment as it appears in tongue music performance in Japan is in fact an extrapolation of a basic melody. And the same basic melody was present in the lute part, which again didn't look at all like what the Japanese make of the lute parts in performance nowadays. And when I managed to get hold of a copy of Johannes Müller's papers on the court musical instruments, in which he included plates representing the notations, the tablatures for each of the 5 melody instruments, it became quite clear that the ensemble was really a heterophonic ensemble with every instrument playing the tune, the same tune, in a different octave and playing it according to its own mechanical limitations. And all this became instantly clear way back in 1953. But at that time I knew no Japanese. Harry Schneider had thrown away her weight about rather. She produced a book on drum patterns in bungaku, that is to say, the part of the tongue repertory that is still danced to. And this was in many respects such an extraordinary book that the then librarian Eric Kiedel and I, Kiedel had been senior lecturer in Japanese in the university, wrote a very critical review which was published in Music and Letters, extremely critical. She treated everybody else who'd ever written about Japanese music as quite hopeless and unworthy of examination at all. Everybody else, that is to say, except Müller, who had been physician to the emperor way back in 1870. And in particularly, she was very critical of Sir Francis Piggott, who wrote the first book on Japanese music, a very sympathetic account of music, and she was quite abusive about that, damning with faint praise and so on. Her translations of parts of the text she was dealing with left a great deal to be desired, and she constantly changed her romanization of the same Japanese text. So Kiedel and I were fairly unkind, and after about 4 years, this review, I gather, was brought to her attention in a rather unkind way. She maybe still is, a professor at the university in Vienna, and there were still plenty of ex or crypto Nazis about the place in the academic world there, and they pounced on this article with glee. She attempted to take Kiedel and myself to court. There was a long battle of the solicitors on either side, and finally she was dissuaded from so doing. She was told by her solicitor that she hadn't a leg to stand on, that it was a fair comment on what she'd done. But to render justice to this woman, and I was astonished one day talking with Arthur Whaley when he said to me, "And do you have any news of the hairy spider?" And I said, "The hairy spider? He said, yes, that's what you called her, Harich Schneider. And I had not the slightest recollection of having produced this perversion of her name. But of course, from a Freudian point of view, it was absolutely the fairest possible representation of my secret thoughts about her. Anyway, if she's still alive, God bless her, because she produced this photograph, which really gave me the clue instantly, and I realized if only one could get the manuscripts, the probability was that one could get back to the original tunes borrowed from the tongue repertory. And I didn't do anything about this until I was moved definitively from zoology to Oriental Studies in 1966. And I was made an assistant director of research, bracket, Oriental music, bracket, in the Faculty of Oriental Studies, whereas I'd been assistant director of research, bracket, zoology, close bracket. It was in fact virtually the same post. The professor of zoology was just on the point of retiring. The incoming professor began to throw his weight about in a manner such as not customary for professors to indulge in Cambridge, and my old professor was made so furious by this that he decided to give my post to Oriental Studies. So zoology lost a post and Oriental Studies gained one. The reason for this being necessary was that before Thurston Dart took the chair of music in King's College London, he had, without previously talking to me about it, persuaded the Faculty Board of Music to seek a post for me in the Faculty of Music in Oriental music. And this had been agreed by the Faculty Board, but at the last minute they thought that it would be courteous to wait until Robin Orr arrived to take up the chair of music vacated by Thurston Dart. When Professor Orr arrived, he said he had other and more urgent teaching needs than an assistant directorship in Oriental music. And so there I was, no possibility of a post. At that point, Oriental Studies leapt into the breach, and especially the then Professor of Chinese, Edward Pullybranch, and began to see what they could do about it. But of course, to persuade the General Board to produce a post in music where you would have an intake of 100 a year, say, and one could imagine that having courses in musical instruments on a worldwide base for the benefit of all incoming musicians and so forth was a very different proposal from having an appointment in Oriental Studies, where there was a very much smaller undergraduate intake each year. And so it wasn't thought very probable that the General Board would create a post here. And then it was that my old professor in zoology handed over the post. And so that was really how I came to be safely seated in Oriental Studies. The building had in Sidgwick Avenue had just been completed, and to my delight and astonishment I found there was a room for me. And there were no students who wanted to do any research in Oriental musics, and so for from 66 until 72, I was able to get on with my research, did an enormous amount of writing. And first of all, again through Keedel's kindness, I've been able to get hold of wind parts of the court music, going back really to the middle of the 19th century, but reprinted in the 30s. And I transcribed the mouth organ part of all the current repertory of about 60 pieces. And it was already clear to me that the mouth organ presented a much simpler version of the tunes than the flutes. The flute and the cylindrical double reed pipe have very much more decorated versions of the tunes, and so it looked as if one were in search of the town originals, it would be sensible to look first of all at the mouth organ scores. And the more I and other people have continued to look at the mouth organ scores, and the older the mouth organ scores we've been able to get hold of, the more it seems that we were absolutely right in deciding that the mouth organ really presented the most unchanged version of all the pieces available to us. It wasn't until 1971 or perhaps 69, quite suddenly I was made aware of the existence for sale in a bookseller in Kyoto of a collection of Gangaku manuscripts of the various genres of the court repertoire, including a certain number of mouth organ manuscripts, but also manuscripts for all the instruments. These were brought to my attention by Elling-Ide, whom I've mentioned before. Professor Twitchett and an American professor were running a small symposium, a seminar, I suppose one would call it, on tongue studies, primarily historical and literary. And Dennis Twitchett, our then professor of Chinese, asked me if I would talk about the tongue repertoire, because I had already exhibited specimens of these tunes in the faculty. And Elling-Ide in particular was enormously taken by the tunes that had come out. They invited me to dinner in Sydney Sussex College, where the conference was housed. And after dinner, when they'd all had a fair amount to drink, on a keyed mouth organ, I played the tunes, and they had various things like ashtrays or newspapers to rub on this, on that, in order to produce friction, percussive effects, and the ashtrays and banging the tables in time music and so on. And a very good time was had by all. And following this, I was invited to Yale to lecture on two occasions. But I was able, with a loan from Jesus College, to buy this collection from the bookseller in Kyoto. And it was perfectly evident to me as soon as I got my hands on a body of manuscripts covering the entire repertoire, and of all the melodic instruments, that the supposition about it being originally being a heterophonic ensemble was absolutely correct. And there was a lute manuscript of 16th century date among the others. And I knew that at that time the then Emperor Momoyama, this is the Momoyama period, had attempted a collation of all existing Tang music manuscripts, and I thought if only I could get to Japan I might find a set of synchronous manuscripts of about that date. And so I gradually prepared for a study trip that would take me progressively across Asia to Japan, and planned to stay for 3 months working in Japanese libraries, going through catalogues, trying to pick out dated manuscripts for all the melodic instruments as early in time as I could. And this is what I did, and worked principally in Tokyo in the Palace Library, in Kyoto in the Kyoto University Library, and also in what was originally a very important private library, the Yome Bunko, which had important manuscripts of the Tang music. And I collected microfilms and photocopies of manuscripts, and came back to Cambridge. I'd like you to hear one of these tunes that came out from the mouth organ part at a very early stage in my work. A tune called literally the Vinous Sogdian. I wondered for a long time what this title really meant. I mean, shortening it, it is simply the wine barbarian, but we know that barbarians in Tang times were almost invariably Sogdians, and so it was clearly a Sogdian who had something to do with wine. But it was a fact that the Chinese were enormously intrigued by a great delight that the Sogdians took in drinking fermented grape juice, whereas, of course, in China, fermented grape juice, though it was known, was not the staple form of alcohol. They were accustomed to drinking either rice wine or rice spirit. It was the Japanese who discovered that this title refers to a puppet, a little mannequin that was dressed as a Sogdian and given the physical characteristics of one with blue eyes and a very prominent nose, possibly red hair, certainly fair hair, that was played with in the houses of prostitution in Chang'an, the town capital. And when the little mannequin fell over and pointed at you, you had to drink a full bowl of wine, and so it was very good for trade. And this is the origin of this. In Chinese, it's a very curious name to qualify a human being with what is normally used as a noun, simply the word wine, and that's why I use this rather peculiar term, the vinous Sogdian. And what I think is so remarkable here is that one immediately feels the appropriateness of the tune to its title and the circumstances. And it quite often happens in Chinese music today that if it were not for the words there or the title, from the music itself, one would not immediately be able to judge what its affect was intended to be, whether it was very sad or happy or what. But in this case, there is a sort of Western certainty about the reference that this tune must have, and of course it comes from a country quite a distance to the west of the Chinese capital at that time, Chang'an. And I think also, of course, in the structure of the tune is so remarkable. It is almost classically Western in the way it's built up, from phrases of equal length, and in this respect again very different from most Chinese tunes, which are very often what we sometimes call durchkomponiert. They flow on without repetition. So here is the wine puppet. that was played about 1971 by undergraduates in Jesus College. For a time we were known as the Jesus College Chinese Band. And then when I, on my journey to Japan in '72, I visited Taiwan, and in Taipei I was in touch with Professor Zhuangwen Li, who has worked a lot on early Chinese musical instruments, and he was interested in my work on the Tang repertory, and he suggested that we give some of these tunes to a group of musicians with whom he was in touch for them to play. And I wrote out a copy of 9 different tunes in the numerical notation, which is commonly used by the Chinese for instruments. And all the performers were told was the title of the piece. And the group was led by a mouth organ player, a shun player, and it included a zither, a lute, horizontal and vertical flute, and a double reed cylindrical pipe, guanzi. And no information other than the title of the piece was given to the performers. So it was left to the shun player, who was leading, to determine the pace. I asked that they should repeat the tune, and that in repeating they should, if they felt it suitable, that they should add decoration as they proceeded. This is a standard thing in Chinese urban popular music today. People will take any tune and embroider it freely, all the instruments doing their own thing. You have to be able to do that if you're a musician at all, and of course you would never use notation at any time. But on this occasion, as one couldn't let them learn the tune by ear, they used the numerical notation. And what delighted me was the balance of the ensemble, because I'd been worried about whether the lutes would really function as a bass in this ensemble, because of course the Japanese think of their performance under the influence of Western listeners as accompanied monody, the most important tune being that produced by the double reed cylindrical pipe, the hichiriki, and the rest of the instruments effectively producing a sort of chordal accompaniment to the melody of the reed pipe. But as you'll hear, it doesn't sound a bit like that. It is very clearly a heterophonic ensemble with the lute acting as a bass, and the lute's bass version of the tune coming through quite plainly in this performance. Agree that the Chinese obviously have the same, absolutely the same kind of response to this tune as I and the students in Jesus College had. Well, when I got back from Japan, miraculously pupils began to present themselves who wanted to work with me. And the result of that was that for a while in Cambridge I had 5 students playing different instruments, Chinese instruments, who were able to take part in the ensemble, who could read the tablatures, could play from the tablatures without transcription, and whose job it was to produce transcriptions of the earliest tablatures available to us. And we have, for example, a 10th century flute manuscript that includes about between a third and a half of the repertory, and which must be very close to the Tang originals, because the definitive borrowing of music from the Tang court took place in 841, when the last mission to China for 300 years returned to Japan. The Tang dynasty was beginning to crumble, and the Japanese saw no point in sending further missions, and they didn't do so for 300 years. And gradually I began to get all these transcriptions together, and now am progressively publishing this entire repertory of about 140 items, some of which are large suites in several movements, so that in due course we'll have all that survives of the Tang entertainment music repertory published in transcription from the oldest surviving manuscripts. The manuscripts themselves, one can see these, for example, this is my oldest mouth organ manuscript. It can be dated at about 1200. This is one which is about a century later, written by a Chinese monk as a commission. This is zither tablature. This is a preface to the suite, part of the preface to the suite. This is its title. The Emperor Destroys the Formations, the music of the Emperor destroying the formations, and the formations are military formations. And then this is lute tablature. This is the end of the contents of the scroll, the last pieces. This is drinking wine. This is a playful handful, and this is martial virtue. And then here comes the Emperor Destroys the Formation, and part of the preface. This is the beginning of the processional, and this is the prelude, the music proper. This volume consists of one suite only, the largest suite that has survived, in two movements only, a prelude and then a quicker and measured movement in 6 sections. The prelude itself is not measured, but it is built up throughout in units, in binary units. One might call it tempo giusto senza misura, whereas the second movement is measured, not always regularly in sixes, but on the whole measured in sixes throughout. And one of the remarkable things, this is an alternative version in the manuscript for zither top line and lute lower stave, and these are all musical glosses written into either the lute manuscript or the zither manuscript, and most of them go back to a century before the date of these two manuscripts. These were produced about 1171, and these annotations have references constantly to the Horikawa Inn emperor, who was the emperor about a century before that date. And it is surely astonishing to see so much scholarship applied to musical manuscripts already in the 12th century. We didn't do anything like that in Europe until the 19th. On my way to Japan, I entered Afghanistan, coming from the Soviet Union, coming from Tashkent in fact, and I inquired of various people about toy instruments, sound producers used by children. I set myself limited objectives at all the ports of call on this journey out, and one thing that I'd discovered when working on the Turkish book was the existence of this children's subculture of sound producers, usually entirely unrelated to the adult instrumentarium and very often including extremely archaic instruments, once of cultic significance in the adult society. And I called on the director of the museum in Kabul, and he mentioned to me an instrument called Tipçebodane, or Tipçebodona, which he described as a little drum, and I couldn't really understand what it was he had in mind, but the information was there, and we went on to other things. He told me of little reed pipes, idioglottal reed pipes with upcut tongues, and he allowed me to see all the beadram ivories that the museum had, and these include many representations of instruments from the 6th or 7th century, and also there were stone figurines, and I was able to make drawings of all these things. I talked with servants in the hotel Srinagar about toys, and I had with me photographs of some of my Turkish children's toys, and they immediately produced parallels and made things for me. And someone had suggested that a good place to go to look for things would be a place called Istalif, which is of some interest because the name itself comes from staphylon, which of course is Greek for the vine, and this was an important center of wine production in the days of Hellenistic Greek colonies in that area. I found a taxi driver outside the hotel who spoke some English. I think in fact the hotel found him for me, and I went off with him to Istalif, and very soon we were asking the villagers about all the things that children played with, and so on and so on. And he was absolutely indefatigable, and suddenly someone mentioned these magic words again, Tipçebodona, and produced this first of all. And as you can imagine, I was terribly excited. And the driver knew that I wanted to buy this, and so he whispered to me, don't you do anything, you go away and I'll bargain. They produced two of them. One uses a sort of double thing, and the other is a single one. Well, the bodana part is the word for quail, and this tipcha is presumably a little drum. So what on earth is a little drum doing with dealing with quail? Well, the fields at certain seasons of the year are full of quail, and the villagers make these things, and they use them both to discover whether quail are there and also to attract quail. And this is a little whistle, and the little drum, this is a wooden spoon, of course, is converted. It becomes a pump effectively when you beat on the diaphragm, pulling the skin together over the bowl of the spoon. And this is a really marvelous device, enabling you to blow a whistle at very high frequency. It wouldn't be possible to whistle as rapidly as that. One couldn't produce that break in the sound simply by either a bilabial whistle, or even if you had a little tubular whistle to blow on. And this is simply a double-ended one in case one should break. When I was in Thailand, the one thing that I had set myself to do was to discover how the mouth organs are made. One gets in the Mekong Delta among the Lao and among the Thai as well, very large mouth organs, fundamentally of the same kind as the mouth organs of China and Japan, but they are famous for producing a sound of very beautiful tone quality. And people have had rather curious ideas about how this comes about, suggestion that they might be using silver reeds instead of bronze reeds and so on. Not realizing, of course, that a silver reed would be quite hopeless because it wouldn't have any elasticity at all. But the difficulty was to know where to go to find mouth organs. I took advice about that. I went to the British Embassy in Bangkok, and I well remember hearing the cultural attaché speaking over the phone in my presence. "I have here an elderly British academic." At least I got advice that I should go to a small town called Khon Kaen in northeast Thailand, and I duly flew to Khon Kaen and set myself up in a hotel, and then went off into the street, and providentially within a few hundred yards I discovered a man selling mouth organs. They're called Ken, on the pavement. And so I got down by him on the pavement, hoping to be able to discover where he lived. And so I drew elaborate pictures of him and of me and of walking to his home and all the rest of it. It didn't produce any effect whatsoever. And then I looked up and there was a Chinese draper immediately behind us. And I went into the draper, but he spoke only Fujianhua from southeast China. And so then I wrote him a little note in terrible Chinese, asking if he would be so kind as to inquire of this man what the name of his home village was. And he did so, and I found the name of his home village, which was Ban Sikyo. And I went back to the hotel. I didn't buy a mouth organ. I went back to the hotel, and I told the clerk at the desk that I would like to hire a taxi and an interpreter, and he produced both, and I went off to Ban Sikyo with this young man who was still at that time attached, I think, to some American Army group in Bangkok, and was used as an interpreter. And we arrived in Ban Sikyo, and I was taken to the home of two men, an elder and a younger, and the elder man's grandfather had also made mouth organs, and I explained through my splendid interpreter, Mr. Kamsi Oton, that I wanted to see, if possible, all the stages in the making of a mouth organ. And with in a wonderfully obliging way, the senior and the younger did absolutely everything for me and showed me everything that they had. The bronze that they use for making the reeds in these mouth organs comes exclusively from the coinage, the bronze coinage of Chulalongkorn Rama V. It was minted about 1910. I was born in 1909. And quantities of these coins are collected whenever they turn up anywhere. They're taken off and melted in an adjoining village, which I didn't visit, and there they're rolled into sheets of metal of about 0.2 of a millimeter thick, I would say, and the villagers purchase such sheets, and then with this little cold chisel they cut the sheets up into strips that are about 3 to 4 millimeters wide, as you see here. The extraordinary thing is that this coinage of Chulalongkorn Rama V was minted either in Birmingham or in Hamburg. And its composition is very, very similar to the composition of our old pennies. When I brought this material back, I wrote to the Royal Mint to inquire about the copper coinage of Chulalongkorn Rama V. And it was the Secretary of the Mint who gave me this valuable information. And I persuaded a friend of mine in Jesus, Dr. Trevor Page, to undertake a metallurgical examination, not only of the coin itself, but also of all the materials that are used in the making of reeds. And when they have these strips, they then hammer them out so that their breadth is increased somewhat, as you can see comparing these two, and of course they become much thinner, and they're hammered and kept cold all the while they're being hammered by having water dripped on the work, so they are cold worked to this thickness and produced in strips of about this length, and then with the same cold chisel they mark out slightly tapering tongues in the metal, and these are the future reeds, single beating reeds that they're going to use in making the mouth organs. It is a marvelous piece of technology with the simplest possible tools, and every stage in the preparation contributes to the mechanical properties of the reed, properties that are essential to its proper functioning in the mouth organ. I've described the whole business of the preparation of the reeds and the metallurgical aspects of their making and their physical properties in a paper with not only with Dr. Page but also with Dr. Atkins, who is a physicist very interested in the purely acoustic side of the properties of the reeds and of these mouth organs. The reeds are inserted in rectangular windows that are cut in the walls of lengths of bamboo. A particular bamboo, a particular species is used for this purpose, and its remarkable property is that lengths between the nodes of the bamboo stems are very considerable, whereas many bamboos have comparatively short internodes. This particular bamboo has very long internodes. And also the canes are remarkably uniform in diameter. And these are imported by the villagers from Vientiane in Lao country. Culturally, these people in northeast Thailand are properly to be regarded as Lao, but they think of themselves as Thai, and of course they are to be referred to as Thai, but much of their musical equipment in songs and types of songs and so on has been shown to belong to Lao territory rather than to be, strictly speaking, Thai. The reeds are set into these rectangular windows by undercutting slightly at each end and pushing the reed in. And the most important point in the manufacture of these instruments that accounts for their extraordinarily beautiful tone is that the reeds are always inserted at a quarter of the distance from one end of the pipe. The pipes are open at both ends. The effect of inserting the reed in this position is to diminish the intensity, in particular of the fourth harmonic, but also of other adjacent harmonics in the total complex of sound that comes out of the pipe. And I had no idea what the significance of this was when I was in Thailand. It was Dr. Atkins who first pointed out to me that the effect of this is equivalent to the reed being inserted at a distance of 1/8 of the wavelength of the sounding pipe, and that this will necessarily produce attenuation of certain of the lower harmonics. His acoustic examination of the properties of the pipes, and I brought back specimen pipes made by these two workers in Bansikyo, was that in fact the second harmonic is very strong in the note from a pipe. The adjoining harmonics, and in particular the fourth, is noticeably weakened in both the high pipes and the low pipes. And there is a cloud of high harmonics at relatively low intensity, forming a sort of haze round the prominent second harmonic. And it's this that accounts for the sweetness of sound altogether. It isn't anything to do with the chemical composition of the reed. It is due simply to the placing of the reed in this position along the pipe, always at a quarter of the distance from one end. Now, it isn't merely that the pipe is open both at its lower end and at its upper end. They're able to control the speaking length by cutting lateral windows in the pipe, and this allows them to assemble the pipes in a purely decorative way, which doesn't really necessarily reflect the real acoustic speaking length of the pipe. If one examines the mouth organ, one can see straight away the presence of this vent at the upper end of the pipe. But it wasn't until I saw the instrument, so to speak, coming into being in that house in Bansico, that I realized that the lower end of the pipe also is laterally vented. And it is these two vents that determine the real speaking length of the pipe. I was puzzled as to what the effect of this lower vent was on the sound of the instrument. And through my interpreter, I asked what would happen if the lower vent were made still lower down the pipe, for example. And so they immediately cut another vent below, and one could hear at once that the sound had not only changed slightly in pitch, but also that it had become coarser in quality and more like an ordinary harmonica sound in the West, or more like a Chinese mouth organ, which doesn't have this sort of golden quality of sound that the Thai mouth organs have. The makers worked independently. An older man and a younger man started to make simultaneously two pipes. They were going to be an octave apart. They didn't measure anything. They inserted the reeds, and the elder man picked up the two pipes and put them together side by side over his mouth and blew the reed, and you couldn't hear that that there was any beat about the octave at all. And I asked if they ever measured anything, and they produced this, which is a strip of bamboo with little steps cut at intervals. And while I got this in my hand, I said, and if I take this away, will you never be able to make another mouth organ? And of course they thought that was extremely funny. And I was assured that they could always start making the lowest pipe of all, and simply by judging tonal quality, doing the venting, getting the sound they want, they could be quite certain about the pitch because of their absolute sense of pitch, and all the rest of the pipes could be generated from this single bass pipe once made. I'm not quite sure now that that is really the whole story. It would be necessary to go back to Thailand and with a really efficient interpreter ask them about it again. Personally now, I don't think that they could do that without having some way of working out. Maybe they do it simply by ear. But if, from the point of view of measurements, they need more measurements than are available perhaps on this measure here, if they're going to be able to generate the whole series. But at least it's quite clear that they have, as a result of years of practice, an enormous fund of technical skill, so that they really don't have to measure things at all. Now, just to hear a little of this colloquy that took place on the ground floor of the house in Bansico. Here are some of the, this is testing the pipes, and I'm asking them to separate the two so that I can hear one pipe sounding by itself. Only one. Only one. Would you like with that one closed? And now you should do the other one. No, not together. And again. And again. Once more. That's fine. And now if you do it with that one too. That's fine. Let's not again.
I'll be late.
Oh, he hasn't done more.
ไล่ไปทีละลูกครับ
เจอลูกเจอท่านไปเจอท่าน
โอ้ล่ะ Now, if you do it once again. Once again.